My talk today is on practices for perfecting my perception of the presence, practicing the presence. And this month of April, we'll be working on raising our consciousness to new heightened levels of God awareness. We could say a resurrected consciousness in honor of this month, which is a life rich in meaning, joy, abundance, and love. We want to reinforce our perception of God's perfect and plentiful presence in our lives. And I have 4 practices. They all begin with the letter P. And each one of these practices will raise your consciousness considerably. But all 4 of them, if we can put them together and do them more often, will create a resurrection consciousness. And we can leave our old lives behind. So the first P is my favorite, practicing the presence. And what does practice the presence of God mean? We hear that phrase a lot. Some of us may have read Joel Goldsmith's book years ago, Practicing the Presence. And when I was preparing this talk, it came to me, I didn't quite have the whole picture of that phrase. Because the word practice suggests activity, doesn't it? Practicing the presence just doesn't mean sitting in silence, feeling after God. It's not just what you feel, but what you do as well. It's not just a sensation, but an act. Like when a doctor says he practices medicine, he's not referring to an emotion, he's referring to an activity. When a lawyer says she practices law, she's talking about her way of showing up in the world, in life, and not a mere feeling. Those of us in religious science are honing our ability not just to feel God, but see God in everything. And according to Ernest Holmes in The Science of Mind, all who endeavor to greet the divinity in everyone they meet, and all who feel a unity of spirit in all people and running through all events, are spiritual or mental practitioners. And I believe all of us here today are spiritual or mental practitioners, trying to bridge the gap between being a metaphysician and a mystic, which is one who lives in true oneness. In order to practice the presence, we must deliberately, consciously make God a part of our everyday life, our every waking moment, our every action. We must deliberately and consciously become an avenue by which God speaks. To be honest with you, I think most people are probably more skilled at practicing the absence of God than the presence. From the moment we get up in the morning, do we think God lives as me? I am an expression of God. Today, I let God be God in me. I'm reminded of the bracelets that were out some years ago, and then there was a bumper sticker. The latest one was "Do it with God," because everything you do is with God. But it used to say WWJD. You maybe remember those. What would Jesus do? That's not a bad question to ask. The thing to remember is that God was no more centered in Jesus than in you. The difference is that Jesus was more centered in God. The creative energy of life itself, the ever presence of light and perfect wisdom and guidance are always in you. There is never an absence, for God is presence. So our need is to get centered in the consciousness in God. In other words, practicing the presence of God is a conscious awareness of the depth of life, our ground of being. When we begin to see God in this way, then God becomes a reality to us, not just a belief. Think like God, be like God, see like God. You are the same consciousness, awareness that was in Jesus, that is in you. He just understood the union of his nature as God, as the oneness in all, whose pure nature of love and peace and joy, that's the pure nature of life. We've just gotten out of our alignment. So there's a Sufi who is in the Mevlevi order, which is Rumi's main order that he founded. And his name is Kabir Helminski. He's one of the foremost translators of Rumi's poems. And he writes in his book, Living Presence, the practice of presence invites us to a conscious relationship with God. Yet the capacity to remember God is related to the ability to be awake. And there's 4 things you can do to stay more awake: to always act with intention, to take plenty of time for reflection, to have diligent self-vigilance, and to be aligned with and be a beneficent person. So living in this awakened state of consciousness that we're calling presence opens us to awe and wonder. Presence signifies the quality of consciously being here. It is the activation of a higher level of awareness that allows all our other human functions, such as thought, feeling, action, to be known, developed, and harmonized. So when we're in presence, we are a witness to all aspects of ourselves, and we can work on them. Presence is the way in which we occupy space, as well as how we flow and move. It shapes our self-image and emotional tone. It determines the degree of our alertness, openness, and warmth. This is the key right here. What I like what he says. Presence decides whether we leak and scatter our energy or embody and direct it. We're so out there in this and that and this and that, and that's wonderful, but come back to presence. And he says, presence is the human self-awareness that is the end result of the evolution of life on this planet. My friends, everyone is waking up. As we become more present, things will change in the world. So understanding that presence is concentrated spiritual energy sufficient to produce will. And with will, the power of conscious choice, Human beings can formulate intentions, transcend their instincts and desires, educate themselves, and steward the natural world to bring it back into alignment. So presence is the potency of will. And just remember, before we continue, I've been kind of speaking like presence is, a human attribute, like we have presence. Are we in presence? And forgive me if I do that, because actually it's the presence of God that is in us. That's all there is acting through us. It wants to be itself in us as us. So it's not our presence. But once we can be in that place more and more, we'll find ourselves extending beyond the boundaries of what we thought was ourself. And then we're freed from separation, from duality. And then we can speak of being in this presence. So I'm going to try an Eckhart Tolle practice. Excuse me. And I would invite you to lean back and relax, close your eyes, and take a few deep breaths. So you want to ask yourself, what's the most important thing in your life? It should be discovering the unconditioned dimension of consciousness, the unconditioned you, the unconditioned I that has nothing to do with your past or physical body or person or personality. We want to discover the deepest reality of who we are, the foundation of your life's existence. So what I would like you to do now, staying relaxed and with your eyes closed, we're going to link up with that which is often hiding, concealed, covered up. As I am speaking these words to you, I want you to notice what is that space between the sentences I'm speaking. That gap between my words. Find the space in your consciousness where you're not thinking. As I'm saying these words, you will notice between them there are spaces. When you are noticing those spaces. You are in presence. You are not thinking. If you're focused on my words, you will notice between them a spacious, alert, stillness. So thank you. And you can come back to the room. I hope you were able to reach that place between thoughts. Do this on your own. When you're aware of your thinking, notice the pauses between your words. The gaps between your thoughts. So I like what Eckhart calls that presence, an unconditioned dimension of consciousness. And he speaks about the idea of achieving spiritual realization. We want to achieve enlightenment. And he says, don't do that. He says, the idea of achieving is an implication that it's not there. It's somewhere in the future. Maybe it's one step away. Maybe it's 1,000 steps away. Doesn't matter. So achieving is good when you set goals in your life and do constructive things. That's the time for achieving. But as far as self-realization goes, he says we're wasting our time. It's all so simple, but subtle. And it's just discovering what's in the present. What's in the presence. And also, a lot of us are like, okay, it's time for my contemplation or my meditation. And now I'm going to stop thinking. And he said, not a good idea. That implies active doing. That you're going to forcefully push out thinking from your consciousness. And that can't be done. That's not the way. The way is to get in that gap that I hope you were all experiencing. All right. So there are 3 other principles, and they're actually not that involved as presence. The second P is practicing the principles. And in this thing called you, Ernest Holmes writes, let nothing come forth from your mouth that you would not wish to have manifested in your life. And Bill Hornaday in Your Aladdin's Lamp says, can you afford the consequences of your thinking? And Jesus, master teacher, said, it is done unto you as you believe. So these are all statements that reflect the principle of life that says what you think, feel, say, believe, value, and do is what your life looks like. So here is kind of a metaphor that Esther Hicks gave us this little story in Ask and It Is Given. And she talks about when you drive your vehicle from place to place, you know your starting place and you know where you want to end up. And you know, at this point in your evolution, you can't like instantaneously get there. So you accept you'll need to travel the distance from this place to that place. And in time, you will arrive at your destination. But you may get eager, impatient to get there, maybe tired of the journey. And so you get so discouraged that when you get halfway there, you turn around and go back to the starting place. Or maybe you go from the starting place to the middle and back again, and to the middle and back again, until you're just exhausted on like a never-ending journey. So don't do any of those foolish things. You have a starting place and you have a place you desire to be. And in Science of Mind, we just know if we keep moving in that direction, we know what is required, we will eventually arrive. So we don't want to get frightened and go back, and before we even made the intention, it's like, I guess it wasn't meant to be. We have to be diligent and keep working on it. You know, like don't say like, oh, spiritual principles don't work, but we're just so impatient. It's all in God's perfect timing. And Ernest Holmes says, taking as the starting point, the idea that the essence of our life is God, it follows that we use the same creative process. Everything originates in the one, comes from the same source, and returns again to it. As God's thought makes worlds and peoples them with living things, so our thoughts makes our world and peoples it with our experiences. So by the activity of our thought, things come into or don't our life. And we're only limited if we don't know the truth. We've thought that outside things controlled us, and all the time we have inside of us that which can change everything, that can release us, give us freedom from bondage. So the third P is practicing prayer. Prayer changes things, but before prayer changes things, what must it change? Us, of course. So I want to be very clear here. If you think that your prayer is for the purpose of getting God to do things for you, you're barking up the wrong tree. No prayer, no matter how fervently or how often it's prayed, will influence God to be more or less than God already is. Prayer is thought that is in tune with the infinite. It's alignment. The great objective in prayer is to be still and know that God is the one life, substance, intelligence, and source of love. To know that in God, all already is, all love, all good, all plenty, all wholeness, all allness already exists. God is all there is and more. He's the unmanifested. The objective of prayer then is to know that because we are God's expressions, that allness that already exists, is our allness. How could it be otherwise? The infinite love, good, plenty, and wholeness that already exists are who and what we are. So we then open our hearts, and rather than beg life to be good or for God to bring good into our lives, we sense, feel, and accept that life is like the sun pouring in on our faces in the morning. It shines on everything. In consciousness, we get out of the shadows. We let the light shine through our innate potential, our being. We are that light. And we proclaim statements of spiritual truth, the good, the positive. We affirm things like, now I am successful. We are now prosperous, now creative, now transformed by the renewing of our minds. And we solidify our belief that what we just said is true by moving into an attitude of gratitude, of thanksgiving. We give thanks for this amazing being that is all, for our place in whatever as the all. We give thanks and then we let it go. We don't dwell on what we feel our needs and desires are, whether they're being met or not. We know it's being taken care of in perfect timing for the good of all. So for those of you who are maybe not so familiar with science of mind, what I just described is called a spiritual mind treatment. And we call it that in religious science, in unity. Joe Dispenza would call it a spiritual mind treatment. And that's our third practice for establishing our perception of God's perfect and plentiful presence in our lives. And you want to make a regular habit of that kind of prayer. If you don't know those 4 steps, it's a good idea to learn them. They've been proven for a few centuries at least to work. So the final one is really just a statement. We're about to conclude here. The final P is practicing powerful partnerships. Yay! That's what we're doing here. So do you have a prayer partner or an accountability partner, mastermind group that you belong to? And if not, why not? Get with friends, book groups, Facebook groups. We really can awaken to our own nature, that it's all of our natures. It's the only nature there is in a group. So hang out with the people you want to be like. So in conclusion, you want to resurrect your consciousness to new heightened levels of God awareness. You want to exponentially protract your perception of God's most perfect and infinitely plentiful presence in your life. So consciously practice these 4 P's, which again are practice the presence, practice the principle, practice prayer, and practice powerful partnerships. So thank you for hanging out with me. And perhaps as just a closing, I don't know how this will go. I want to sing a little prayer for you. Beloved Lord, Almighty God, through the rays of the sun, through the waves of the air, through the all-pervading life in space, purify and revivify us. And we pray, heal our bodies, hearts, and souls. Amen. And so it is.
How many, my dear